Hey everybody, so I'm joined here with the fellow traveler. You identify as a Marxist Leninist, am I correct?
You know it.
So, what compels you to support this particular ideology instead of anarchism or other strains of left wing thought?
Hard evidence, compelling data, science. Uh, Pretty much, Marx came along and laid down the foundation for scientific socialism with his critique of political economy, and along with Frederick Engels, and of course other Marxists have come along. And Lenin came along and provided a very useful template for how to organize a political organization that can guide the masses towards socialism, which has, I want to say, it's been successful. I mean, the methods and strategies used by Marxist Leninists have successfully established socialism in dozens of countries around the world, lasting socialism for a while. And I mean, most of those countries, majority of them are gone now, but I would say they had a pretty good run. And I want to pick the theory that is the most scientifically sound and has the highest success rate, which is why I lean towards Marxism Leninism. Now, how about yourself? Why are you an anarchist?
Well, I'm an anarchist because I reject all unjustified hierarchies. That includes the state, that includes capitalism, that includes transphobia, homophobia. All of those are fundamental to me. It's all part of this broader plan of creating a more just and equal society. And I don't consider empiricism as relevant as you do because you could argue in a feudal era that, oh, capitalism won't work because it's never been tried before. That could be a rationale to justify continuing policies of feudalism. So I just think that empiricism has its limitations without some underlying rationality in the mix.
Well, sure. Uh, but all we have right now is the empirical evidence, and you don't have to call the socialist countries that have existed socialism. You can call them Schmeckeldorf. You can call them Brugenheimenschmidt. Call them what you will, as long as we know what countries we're talking about. But when I look at the industrial output and the economic developments and the consistently higher living standards provided by the socialist countries compared to their capitalist counterparts. I'm not talking like America versus like Cuba, mind you. I'm talking about Cuba versus another quote unquote liberated non socialist country of similar like development. Like when you compare the countries like say Haiti, Cuba versus Haiti. Like Cuba is objectively a better place to live. Like I'm just telling you right now. Like they have like the highest life expectancy in all of Latin America. They are the only economy on earth to have achieved green, sustainable economic development. And I know empiricism can only go so far. However, when you have a scientific theory and models, and you're able to make predictions with those models, then
Well, can I interject for a moment?
go ahead.
So my fundamental problem is that if you look at something from a purely empirical lens, you're just going to be in one place. It's going to be stagnant. You're not going to go anywhere. So I do think that empiricism is necessary, but to a certain degree. And I agree with you that for many developing societies, whether you look at Burkina Faso in Africa, whether you look at Cuba, whether you look at Libya to a slightly significantly lesser degree, but the point is, I agree with you that socialism to a large degree is preferable to its capitalist counterparts. But fundamentally, I don't think the Marxist Leninist perception of the world of particular political structures goes far enough because it's still inherently based on subjugation, but instead by the government rather than the private sector. And I'd argue that you could see many successful examples of anarchist societies that have prospered and thrived, whether it be in Israel, Mexico, in northeastern Syria. It's one of the most progressive areas in the entire Middle East. It is essentially a libertarian socialist society of the Kurdish Muslims. So I feel like the issue is a little bit more complicated and nuanced than the image that you're portraying.
All right. Um, Shoot, I totally lost my line of thought. I totally forgot what I was going to say next. But what I actually I remember. Let's go back a bit. Uh, so what is oppression? What is authoritarianism? I'm just asking in general. Like, what exactly is authoritarianism to you?
I think authoritarianism is when you undermine the value of an individual, whether it be through labor, whether it be by putting them down in transphobia, homophobia. It's just undermining the value of a human being and undervaluing their worth in society. That to me fundamentally is oppression in the vaguest philosophical way possible that I can comprehend in this exact minute. Like,
Well,
if you gave me some more time, I could probably give you a better like dictionary definition, but that's just what I came up with
well,
just this second.
authoritarianism, at least to me, and as in general as I
Oh, I
understand
thought
it,
you asked. Oh, sorry, I thought you asked about oppression.
just oppression, authoritarianism, specifically authoritarianism. So the reason why I was asking about that is because would you say that authoritarianism, as defined as one person imposing their will upon another, is a fair definition of the word?
Yes,
One
I
one
would.
one person oppressing another, or one person imposing their will on another. I think that's a fair definition of authoritarian. So the police are.
Not necessarily. So I do think that authoritarianism necessitates some systemic power because Antifa, you could argue Antifa is authoritarian because in a Milo event, they might spray paint someone's face. But at the same time, I don't think that's authoritarianism because of the lack of systemic power there.
I mean, systemic or not, they're still imposing their will on another human being. And I completely agree with what they're doing, by the way. I like Antifa. But you can't deny that what they're effectively doing with their counter protests is to silence, thwart, and circumvent far right thought.
But I don't think it's authoritarian because I don't think they have any systemic power. I don't think it's comparable to a government doing what they're doing.
Yeah, but I mean, they're still well organized and they keep like fascist databases and they like track like when this is going on. So when you have like a group of people who are militarized, well, not like militarized, but they're organized in a like tightly knit manner in such a way, and you get enough people together to say form a territory where there's a list of laws that you all agree upon to follow, and if you don't follow those laws then the police are going to crack down. I mean, isn't that sort of a state?
Correct, but I still think that a level of power is necessary to be authoritarian, and I don't think Antifa has that. And I agree that there is some planning at a decentralized level, like Black Lives Matter, like the Women's March, but at the same time, I don't think it's fundamentally in its core authoritarian in its nature. And I also disagree with the premise of your argument because Marxist Leninism and state communism in general will inevitably manifest and turn into state capitalism. When you look at Che Guevara, you brought up Cuba. When you look at Che Guevara's critique of the Soviet model, he said it fundamentally functions as state capitalism because there's no labor theory of value. It's essentially subjugation and domination by the state rather than by private corporate entities.
Yeah, I've heard. Are you still there?
I'm here.
Okay. Uh, yeah, I've heard this argument before that the Soviet Union is state capitalism. The issue with this argument is, I mean, where's the surplus value going to? None of the state bureaucrats are enriching themselves, really. Like, generally, like, the wealth gap in the Soviet Union at its largest was, like, at a 10-to-1 ratio, and that was, like, near the end under Gorbachev. Like, in general, like the surplus value was being expropriated from the workers, but it wasn't going into the pockets of like the statesmen or like the people that were in charge.
Well,
It was going into the common fund for like infrastructure, 5-year plans, and like the social spending and so on. Like,
I will. So I will concede that it didn't. The level of inequality in, say, the Soviet model or in Mao's China isn't comparable to what you see in capitalism. And even you saw this with the Soviet Union in the 1990s when it began to liberalize its economy. It went downhill. You saw
dude, everything went to shit,
exactly. So I
dude.
agree with you on that
Like
particular point.
when they basically went into anarcho-capitalism, if you think about it.
Yeah, and
Under
now it's
Yeltsin.
basically now it's basically an oligarchy. But at the same time, I do think there's some level of inequality in the Soviet Union, some level in Maoist China that's unacceptable to one degree or another. And fundamentally, that's one of the reasons, along with U.S. imperialism, that these systems sort of unravel. Because if you think about it, when you look at Marxism in a holistic and broader context, it's not true Marxism because what is the first phase of Marxist theory? It's capitalism. So you create this abundant surplus of resources and then you socialize the means of production and redistribute. So fundamentally, it's not Marxism at its core. It's a revisionist interpretation and implementation of Marxism.
The thing is with that is the Soviets weren't even capitalist when they went socialist. They were still semi-feudal.
Correct.
I
That's
mean,
correct.
I will agree that a higher mode of production is definitely necessary. Like, but the thing is like everything was basically public property. I understand like it was state-owned enterprises, but like my point still stands that in general there wasn't really any overall exploitation really going on. The
I, I would disagree.
Well, it was exploitation, but but the surplus wasn't going into the pockets of anyone who clearly owned the means of production. A lot of those bureaucrats and representatives and like people that got into like positions of power and authority were put there by like lower level Soviets or like, people in the trade unions and such.
You're right. That's 100% true that it was put into power by the trade unions and by the Soviets. But ultimately, when you accumulate that kind of power, it does corrupt to one degree or another. And I also want to address the final phase of communism. Well, technically, the final phase of the three-phase Marxist-Leninist plan, which is the ultimate erosion of the state. Do you believe in that ultimate end goal where the state just erodes itself naturally, dissolves itself once people don't feel the necessity of it existing?
I have kind of a different theory than that, but I more or less agree. What'll happen is when global socialism is established, as class antagonisms die down, and as social antagonisms begin to like slowly resolve themselves as we become more and more egalitarian, along with the advance with AI and like cybernetics and automation, a lot of the functions of the state will be automated. Like I do believe that over time, what we perceive as a state. I don't think that the government will ever truly go away, but I think what we perceive as a government and perceive as a state, that very concept is going to evolve and change. I think the state as a concept as we see it today is going to wither away, but I don't believe that we're ever going to truly be in a society without a government.
Yeah, I agree with you. People don't understand the distinction between the government and the state, which is problematic. But
Yeah.
I'd also add that that's another disagreement I have with Marxists. I just don't see it happening. Like, how do you go from the vanguard, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and suddenly, out of the lack of necessity, the state just magically dissolves? I don't agree with that particular notion because I just think power is just too corrupting. You just don't want to let go of it.
Well, one of the reasons, I think that's an excellent point. One of the reasons why the Soviet Union failed to achieve communism, well, obviously because America was on the other side of the world, but one of the other reasons, I believe, is because they failed to abolish the value form, or abolish money. The problem is they the way like trade relations went on were similar to that of capitalism. There was some limited degree of commodity production, but you can have commodity production in socialism. Like, there's nowhere in Marx he says you can't have commodity production. There's a limited amount, but
Correct.
the issue is that they they didn't abolish money. Like, that's one big one right there, because I personally am in favor of the labor voucher system, where you it doesn't circulate, they expire after a while. They're notes that are issued to individual laborers, and basically what this does is it permanently shuts off the accumulation process and effectively circumvents things like black markets, like what we saw emerge near the end of the Soviet Union's like time.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, what would you say about modern China? Do you consider that communist?
Fuck no.
Oh, all right. I was getting worried for a second. Like I thought you were gonna take that route.
No, no, no. With the political party that I work with, they're very sympathetic to China. And I understand why, because they have their communist roots, but I really don't think what they're doing now can really be called socialism. I mean, yeah, there's state planning, but like they have billionaires in their party. Like
Exactly. So,
like there's a difference between Lenin's NEP state capitalism, where they allowed private ownership like during the 20s, and the kind of capitalism that China tolerates. The bourgeoisie under Lenin were not powerful or influential enough to really like influence the government in any meaningful way. That is not the same case in China. The bourgeoisie in China have grown much larger and much more powerful, and though the Communist Party does like have a hard grip on the economy as a whole, it's ultimately like the billionaires are have sway at the same time. So, do I think that Xi Jinping has a little button that he's going to press in 2050 and automatically turn China socialist? No. And one of the reasons why is because Xi Jinping himself is an oligarch.
exactly.
He has a net worth in the hundreds of millions.
And yeah, I when I talk about this issue, people tell me, "Oh, you don't understand. It's dialectical Marxism. You know, he's using capitalism to ultimately socialize the means of production." That is such an idealistic thing to say. That's so not rooted in reality. I mean, he's extracting resources from foreign countries. He's doing imperialism, neo-imperialism. He's,
Yeah,
I mean, there's
it's soft imperialism.
you're right,
It's
correct,
not like military boots on the ground, full on
correct.
occupation. I mean, it's just China's basically exploiting Africa. I mean, just like the West has. Honestly, they're getting their cut of the pie now. Like now that we've come in and we've gotten ours. It's I guess it's the Chinese turn. Honestly,
That's right.
honestly, when it comes to the issue of China, I have mixed feelings about China. I don't think they're socialist, but do I think they're an Capistan laissez-faire free market capitalism like, that the libertarians like to bring up? No, they're not. I mean,
Absolutely not.
if you think about it, state capitalism is technically the most efficient and effective form of capitalism that there is because
Apologies, by the way. The garage in my house is going on.
that is fine. Uh,
All right.
like what do you think about that? Like state capitalism is basically the most effective form of capitalism there is.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think social democracy is the most effective form of capitalism there is, because I feel like that's borne out by the empirical reality of the Scandinavian model. And I understand that social democracy is a pretty crappy ideology when you look at it in the context of what you want society to ultimately become. But as far as capitalism is concerned, I think mixing the private sector with a strong welfare state is the best way to go.
Yeah. Um, the reason why I was saying state capitalism is the best is just because like you can use direct like economic planning, like pretty much like 5-year plans. Like it was pretty much like a state capitalist structure that developed like the Asian tigers and allowed China to develop. Um, but I feel like we're getting kind of off topic. Can we get back to some of the stuff you might disagree with? And we can go back to that because
Right.
this conversation feels kind of generic. No offense.
Correct. So the death toll. Do you want to address the argument that's often made that hundreds of millions of people died under communist regimes?
Yes. So here's the thing: those death tolls originate from the Cold War, from like the likes of historians such as Robert Conquest. You had him. You had other historians, like obviously they're on the opposite end of the Soviet Union, so there's a reason to lie about stuff like that. But like the Soviet archives have been released in like the 90s that largely refute that shit. Like
Perhaps the numbers have been exaggerated or hyperbolized, but at the same time, I do think it's an inevitable consequence of giving the state that much power. And even though many of those deaths were involuntary, it's still a staggering amount. Even if you cut the number by 50%, it's still a
Well,
staggering number.
well, we're talking like 90% reduction when compared to 8 million people who died in the gulags versus only about a million over a 30-year period. There are
I mean,
there are
we're
specific.
still talking pretty significant numbers here.
Oh yeah, yeah, no, the gulags sucked. But the gulags were a vestige of the Tsarist era. Like when Tsarist Russia collapsed, I mean, the Bolsheviks kind of like slipped in and took their place because the regime was going to collapse anyways. The Russian Empire was a fledgling empire and it was coming to an end anyways. And we could see this at the end of World War One. And the gulags were a penal system that existed under the Tsars, and at least based off the data that I've seen, the gulags under the socialists were way better than the gulags under the czars. Like we're talking like a mortality rate of like 3% versus like a mortality rate of like 20%.
What about Holodomor?
A drought. There were a litany of reasons why the famine happened. Combination of a failure of the Soviet state apparatus to properly plan for collectivization, along with bad weather, diseased crops, kulak sabotage. There were a number of things that played into it.
Don't you think racial animosity played? You think racial animosity played zero role in what happened with Ukrainians? Do you think it at least played a little bit of a role in the animosity?
No, not at all. I mean, maybe some nationalistic tensions, but the thing is, if it was Russia's goal to starve out the Ukrainians, then why is it that the food aid was being sent to like the cities and like all of the most populated rural or areas, you know, where the densest amounts of Ukrainians were in the region? You know what I mean?
No, I agree with you. I oftentimes find inconsistencies in human behavior, but at the same time, I don't think it dismisses the fact that there were some nationalistic sentiments, as you acknowledged to some degree.
Yeah, but I don't think it was like a deliberate. Like, listen, even like Conquest himself, Big Boy himself, and like has come out and said like, you know, yeah, no, it wasn't really like that. It was just a failure of the Soviet government to like plan properly for food production.
Noam Chomsky makes the point that there's not a significant distinction between people dying through deliberate killing and people dying because of the carelessness of the state. And I feel like millions of the deaths attributable to communism is because of a careless state that had excess sums of power, which is what fundamentally anarchism is opposed to.
All right, so something I do want to say is famines are a very common occurrence in undeveloped, poor countries, and even like feudal countries, and Russia all the way up, at least like that region of the world, all the way up until like the late 1920s was still, for all intents and purposes, semi-feudal. And people always use the famines against socialism as an argument against it, but if you look at like the start of the 5-year plans, there was one famine under socialism, and then they never had another famine again. But if you go before socialism, they had periodic famines that swept the countryside on a perpetual
obviously
basis.
Socialism is preferable to feudalism. I agree with that.
And it's preferable to capitalism as well, because I can tell you that
yeah.
to this day, there are millions of people starved to death unnecessarily on a yearly basis.
Yeah, the death toll for capitalism is over 200 million. I mean, I'm no fan of capitalism.
More like a billion. If we're gonna go by like the same metrics used by like the people who wrote the Black Book of Communism.
You're right. 200 million is a very conservative estimate.
Oh, 200 million, yeah. Just if you, that's like World War I, World War II, and like the U.S. Settling of the United States alone, like the genocide of the Native Americans and World War I and II alone.
Correct.
Like that's
not even including the deaths that are indirectly related to capitalism through depression, the overconsumption, those various other factors as well.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, I acknowledge the blunders and excesses that took place under the socialist countries that existed, but at the same time, am I going to let the fact that, okay, so they made some mistakes early on, and then things got way better afterwards? Like, so when the first time a government is pioneering socialism, the first time ever, mind you, ever. This is the first time anything like this has ever been done on such a large, massive scale. Because they made mistakes in the beginning, or because it's a flawed system for XYZ reasons, that means that, that cause and that that type of world they're trying to build isn't worth supporting.
Well, at the same time, oh, sorry for the background noise, but at the same time, I feel as though even if, to a large extent, when you look at post-Soviet economy, the failures, when you look at the failures of modern China as it moves more towards capitalism, even though I acknowledge that, I do feel as though we're not reaching our full potential with communism, state-based communism, which ultimately I still believe manifests as state capitalism, because even though the levels of inequality, the extraction and exploitation isn't comparable to what happens under capitalism, it is still a significant problem because it's just human nature. I feel like state-based communism goes antithetical to human nature, because when you give a human being that much power, it's inevitably going to have corrosive ramifications and consequences.
So wait, are you saying like the Soviet Union was like an autocracy? There was just one or a handful of people with like absolute power?
I wouldn't. Autocracy is a very strong word. I wouldn't go that far, but I do think it was far, far too authoritarian. Same with
I
Mao's China,
I
and
I would say the Soviet people did not enjoy political democracy, at least to the same extent that we do in the West, but like they had a much greater leeway of workplace democracy. I mean, I don't know about you, man, but I would rather be able to criticize my boss than, I don't know, some senator all the way out in Washington. You know what I mean?
but I mean the businesses were these. It was centralized planning by the government. The state was the central power here.
Yeah. I mean, central planning, I don't really have a problem with central planning at all. I think the whole economy should be planned, to be honest.
But I mean, this is not a democratic institution we're talking about. I mean, I believe in planning as well. In fact, I feel like as an anarchist, I believe on a communal level we can socialize the means of production. I believe in socialism, but I feel like state capitalism just is far too authoritarian, and I describe it as state capitalism because I feel like that's the ultimate inevitable consequences of state-based communism.
well,
But why do you disagree with that?
because the reason why the socialist countries are no longer socialists anymore is for reasons more nuanced than they were authoritarian. I will grant that I
I
think that
agree.
I do I will grant to you that the lack of political democracy was definitely a contributing factor in their demise, but there were a number of other things too. Partly the way their economies were structured, they didn't abolish the value form, they didn't transition away from money. Another thing is like as an economy grows larger, as the industrialization process is completed, there's a need to transition to like a service sector. You see this in the West, and the socialist countries, specifically the Soviet Union, never transitioned to the consumerist, service sector economy, primarily because they needed to compete with the United States arm race. Like that's actually what they were planning, and like I think like in their fourth or fifth 5-year
Let me just
plan.
let me just interject for a second and say I don't disagree with anything you're saying. In fact, I believe in socialism. I believe in socializing the means of production.
Yeah. So
I
then
just
let me ask you something then. So then, how would you do it different if you weren't going to have a state? Let's say you have your anarchist revolution. You have your revolution, hooray! Anarchists
No, I
won.
don't believe in that kind of revolution. I believe in a progressive transition towards that. I think ultimately we move towards social democracy, and then we move towards the socialization of the means of production, and then people. It's not going to be the natural erosion of the state. We're going to democratically decentralize the state and expand it through a communal form. You're seeing this in northeastern Syria. There's anarcho-syndicalist societies in
But
Israel and
but
Mexico,
but
and
I don't want to decentralize Amazon. I don't want to decentralize all our major industries. I want these to stay centralized because it's way too convenient. And like,
I wanted to I want the major industries to be centralized and owned by the workers. I agree with you, but I want, from a
yeah,
political level,
turned
I
in.
want
Yeah, we need to turn them into public property. But like,
correct.
I mean, I just don't understand why you're so spooked by the concept of a chain of command.
I am very spooked by that concept. And here's another fundamental problem, the distinction I have with anarchism and Marxism. I'm glad you brought up the chain of command thing. What does Marxism say about social issues? I mean, is there any clear cut? I know it advocates for feminism, but in this modern day and age, what does it say about trans issues? What do you believe in social issues? Do you believe that they're less significant? Are you a brocialist? Like, what's your position?
Uh, I'm going to be pretty blunt. I'm more of a class reductionist when it comes to this. My attitude is that at the end of the day, like, economic issues are generally like what's they're generally what plague everybody the most, and the issues of bigotry that exist is really just divide and conquer on behalf of the ruling class. And that, you can have a pink capitalism, you can tackle these social issues all you want, and that's great, go for it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we have the first trans queer POC president if that president is still fucking over like working class people like anybody else. Just look at Barack Obama. There were like more deportations under him than like any other president. He expanded the drone program. He's the harshest president ever on marijuana. Like,
I agree with that, but
yeah.
I don't believe in that form of identity politics either. But do you think that, for example, patriarchy, all these various notions, do you think they're a consequence of capitalism?
I believe that patriarchy and other forms of discrimination are a consequence of class society in general. It doesn't have to be capitalism. It can be feudalism or any of the ancient societies, or, just class society in general. You're going to have haves, you're going to have have-nots, and it can manifest in other ways outside of like class. I mean, you have social roles that form, and this is why Marx talks about the base and the superstructure. And I mean, I would say, well, I would say pretty much, yeah. It's really just that. It's a byproduct
Yeah,
of class society. Black people are only discriminated against because you have the roots of colonialism and slave society that were.
but I don't think it's exclusively based on capitalism or any system that's oppressive in its nature or class based, because you see a lot of people that are critical of capitalism, and you alt-right people that say capitalism is terrible, horrible, but they still believe in white identity politics, white identitarianism. You have people that are transphobic, want to move to conservative values.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. These people are. Fuck. Sorry about that. My friend here
That's
dropped
fine.
out, but we're back. We're back. Okay, go on. What were
No,
you
we're
saying?
back. So, just to summarize in the most basic way possible, I think that economics does contribute to these social issues, but I think that there are some distinctions, and that's one of the things I like about anarchism is that it talks about all unjustified hierarchies, and I feel like on social issues it's far more profound than Marxism.
Okay. So what exactly would you classify as an unjustified hierarchy then?
Transphobia.
No, I mean like a general definition. Like, what is an unjustified
Oh, I
hierarchy?
thought you meant an example. Sorry. I feel like, so according to anarchism, the people on a communal level determine which hierarchies are justified and which hierarchies are unjustified. So if you can, I can't think of any right off the top of my head, but if the society can determine that a certain particular hierarchy is justified, then under an anarchist society, we can still operate with those particular hierarchies, but it has to be voluntary.
Oh, okay. So you don't ever see a situation like that backfiring then, where the majority of people decide that there's a certain, like, I don't know, role or position in like an institution that isn't required, and they have that pulled, and then suddenly the planning and organization becomes kind of a mess. Like,
But
how far are we taking this? Just curious.
but I feel like that's more of a pragmatic concern that could apply to any particular democratic structure. And I acknowledge that there can be pragmatic concerns that stem from a particular system, but the fundamental concept itself is still preferable to state communism, where essentially you have coercion and subjugation of a large swath of the population by the state rather than by private sector capitalist entities. And you're right. I mean, even through a direct democracy, which is what most anarchists advocate for, you will still have these issues, these
Oh,
pragmatic
oh,
isms. But
direct democracy. So my issue with this is like getting decisions made and planning is going to take forever if you have everything just democratized. Like what we're gonna make, how much of this, how much of that. How are we going to come to this decision? Are we going to build a road here? Or how much land and
I
resources are we
disagree
going
with
to
that.
allocate? What do you mean? Like,
Look at worker-owned cooperatives. They're far more efficient. They're far more effective than the traditional private sector hierarchy. I mean, democracy is far more efficient, far more effective than the traditional hierarchical structure that's so bureaucratic, that's filled with red tape, that's filled with people with maniacal intentions and contradictory. I feel like democracy is the smoothest way to create a prosperous society because
but
it gives power to the hands of the people.
but even in co-ops, they still have like bosses and managers. Like, I mean, they might be elected or they might be
Well, it
chosen off
depends.
of merit. I know it
Well,
depends on the co-op, but go on.
well, I know we can't just brush that aside, though. I mean, it is critical to understand the distinction between different types of worker-owned cooperatives. I mean, not all of them have to have a solidly established managerial class, and even if they do, at least the people have a vote. At least the people have a say at the table, and I think that's fundamental, and I think that's critical to creating a prosperous society. I mean, I don't think the state should be a proxy or a representative of the people. I think the people should directly be part of the system.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Um, yeah, like I said, my issue with that is it just sounds like you're gonna have like in a nation like America of 300 and some odd million people. I really don't know how you're going to direct and coordinate the masses without having some sort of like higher order structure or authority or like planning bodies, decision making. Because I don't know about you, man, but I don't really want to leave it up to the democratic will of the people on how we're gonna like engineer a rocket ship. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like there's certain things that should be left up to like certain sets of
Okay, but
professionals.
innovations in democratic societies have been significantly greater than innovations in non-democratic societies. I mean, are you going to deny that?
No, 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 no. But what I'm trying, yeah, no, no. Like, I don't deny the power of open source. But what I'm trying to say is that after a certain point, like, you need like properly trained minds for things like that. Like, I'm not, yeah, I'm not estranged to the notion of open source or having people like get together with things like that. But I'm just saying that for like I don't really know how you're going to do it without a government. Like, how are you going to. How are you supposed to expropriate enough surplus value to build an army to protect yourself from counter revolutions and invasions from the outside? Because capitalist countries are going to come in and try to wreck your shit, like
Well,
one way or
so
another.
no, I feel as though we can. So I actually had a video where I laid out fundamentally the plan to get to this particular society. So I'm not one of those anarchists who have a very swift perspective where they want to quickly do this revolution, overthrow a government, and fundamentally socialize the means of production and have a stateless society without any unjust hierarchies. I'm not that mindset, but I do believe in a slow transition from social democracy to the socialization of the means of production to the ultimate toppling of the state. And like I said, I mean, you see this with northeastern Syria. I mean, there many struggles. The Kurds have many struggles. They're being invaded by Turkey, but they have a strong army. They're pretty strong in the context of that very volatile region of the globe, the Middle East.
Oh
So I
yeah,
feel like there is an empirical basis for what I'm saying. Like, it's not complete pie in the sky.
yeah, 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 yeah. But the thing is like they have a standing army. They have police. They tolerate private ownership. They
But it's
like
still a libertarian social. It's primarily a libertarian socialist society.
yeah. But I mean like when you have like you know representatives and decision making bodies and like cops and like an army. I mean, isn't that sort of becoming a state? Like, I
So
mean,
do you know the YouTube channel Non-Compete?
yeah, not really a
So
big
they,
fan of him, but go on.
but they have this brilliant series talk about how an anarchist society would function, and I do believe in the Peace Corps to, a series of people that are relatively well trained, that have expertise in psychology and human emotion and the state of the human mind, because to me that's far more critical and far more significant to creating a safe society than this attempts at, these harsh punishments, 10, 20 years for crimes, the death penalty. I feel like that's what really deters instability on a societal level, and I think that's far more preferable than this police that are bashing your skull and stuff like that, which you do see with the Soviet Union, which you did see with Mao's China.
No, no, I didn't say there weren't police in the Soviet Union or Mao's China.
No, I'm not saying. I'm just giving an example.
Yeah, I hear you. But the thing is that even in like anarchist experiments, you see things like this. Like, you know about the CNT-FE?
I'm not well aware about that.
Did you Spanish Catalonia during Spain's
right.
Civil War? CNT-FE. It was basically an anarchist. I mean, no pun intended, state that existed in Catalonia. They had massive backing from the Soviets, and did you know that they had labor camps? Did you know that they did penal punishment and labor?
Well, anarchism isn't a monolithic concept. I mean, I personally don't advocate for that particular model. I personally prefer what the democratic confederalism that's going on in northeastern Syria. I like anarcho-syndicalism that's going on in Mexico and Israel, where they have a largely union-based system. So I'm sure anarchist societies can go wrong. I mean, human beings can fuck up virtually anything. I mean, but at the same time, I do feel like from both a theoretical perspective and a material perspective, I do feel like anarchism is more tenable to me than Marxism, because I feel like it's more built on human nature than Marxism.
Well, hold on. Let me stop you there. Do you know what Marxism is? Could you classify Marxism for me?
Well, there's various strains of Marxism. I can't give you a one sentence summary. I can go through the phases for you, like
you just you can just describe what Marxism is, just in general.
So Marxism, at least traditionally, it's this ultimate goal of creating a communist society. It starts with it's a move away from the European systems, which Marx was in. That's what primarily influenced Marx, right? He was seeing what was going on in Europe, and he fundamentally opposed it. He saw it as corrosive in its nature, so he created the system with Engels, which was written in the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, various forms of literature, where he envisioned a society where we ultimately socialize the means of production, and we create an economy that's far more beneficial to workers, that gave power to workers. And sorry, I'm being inarticulate here.
Well, hold on. That's not.
What do you disagree with my summary on?
The issue is that it's not like an idea or an ideology so much as it is a social science. Marxism is a scientific form of social analysis. It's a social science. It is a critique of political economy. That's what it is at its very heart, that's at its very root and its core, and that includes all of its deviations and variations and so on. Various Marxists have come along with their own contributions to theory, their own different ideas and studies within the capitalist system, but ultimately it's one big critique of capitalism, and Marx's solution was scientific socialism as abstract or contrasted from utopian socialism, where
you're right. Utopian socialism advocates for voluntarily.
You sort of like what you're kind of about, like utopian socialist.
Not quite.
Basically, thought that with moral arguments you can convince enough people, and eventually, we can peacefully transition to a socialist society in that way. And the issue with it is, like, they tried. Like, they did sort of, like... They had these experiments, like, you had, like, what's his name? Like, Owen and, like, Saint Simon. You had, like, some bourgeoisie of the time would go out and they'd buy land, and they would form communes, pretty much, outside.
Okay, but you feel...
But they didn't last.
But can't you see how one of the reasons why perhaps... diverging from utopian socialism, but straying in that similar sort of area, can't you see how anarchist societies partially fail to develop to the same extent, the same prevalence as perhaps a more Marxist-based system, because Bakunin and these various anarchist intellectuals were sort of censored by the far left to a large extent. Can you understand that?
Censored. I don't know exactly about any anarchists being censored,
They were
what
they were
but what
they were
I
maligned, rejected by the far left councils and societies, and they were essentially ostracized and not treated the same way as someone like Karl Marx was.
yeah. Honestly, man, you're hitting me in a blind spot here because I honestly don't know like
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
enough about that. But what I will tell you is there have been varying degrees of anarchist experiments that have existed throughout the last century or so, and they don't really seem to take off any further than like really small like pockets or areas of land. Like, yeah, you state the example with Rojava. Well, like the Kurdish territory is like it's like a province within Syria. Same with like the Zapatistas in Mexico. They number in the thousands. The Zapatistas do.
This is why I don't look at things from a purely empirical perspective. You also have to look at it from a rational perspective. Sure, we haven't had these massive, large projects of anarchist societies, but like I said, if we had a purely empirical lens, we'd be stagnant as a society. So also look at it from a logical human nature perspective. Marxism, to me, fundamentally is antithetical to human nature because, like I said, when you create this dictatorship of the proletariat, when you have the vanguard, when you have these people that are so powerful and have such great levels of power, it'll inevitably manifest as state capitalism. Whereas with anarchism, you're appealing to this desire to get along, cooperate.
Why are we trying to appeal to some notion of human nature for? Human nature isn't a fixed thing, it's dynamic. If you ask the Romans or the Zulus or the Chinese what their conception of human nature is, I guarantee you they're all going to give completely different answers.
Correct. There is cultural, socially. I feel like I have to interrupt here because.
All right, go ahead.
Because I feel like because I acknowledge the core of what you're saying, that social engineering largely influences our behavior and it's largely a social construct. But I do feel like human nature is relevant when we're having this discussion. But now you can continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So Marxism isn't about human nature. What it's about is studying like it's a materialist worldview. The whole core of Marxism is that all of the progress that we've had in society is a byproduct of class struggle, like struggles between classes and between different groups of people. And the more we progress as a society, the fewer social classes that we have, all the way up until where we are now, where there's really only two classes left. And it's based on the conception that eventually the antagonisms between workers and owners are going to intensify so much that there is going to be like an uprising, an insurgence, an overthrow of one class by another. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without the proletariat, but the proletarian can exist without the bourgeoisie. So you overthrow the capitalists, and I know this is all theory, you're familiar with this, but
yeah,
the thing is that when you establish socialism, ideally everyone should be paid the same. There are certain things that the Soviets didn't do or didn't achieve.
But Marxism was actually anti-egalitarian. He didn't believe that everyone should get the exact same pay.
Well, hold on. Marx understood that people were not equal in their abilities and their talents, but the one thing that Marx was in favor of something like a labor voucher system. Same with like Engels, and the whole point of the voucher system, like everyone does get paid, not exactly the same, but what it does is it's everyone gets paid according to their productivity. So like, you put in an hour of time and you produce, let's say, 4 shoes. What? Sorry, folks, we were rudely interrupted. I totally lost my train of thought. But I think I remember what I was going to say.
You're talking about how it's based on how productive you are to society. That's just the value of labor.
It's based on your productivity. I mean, you don't get the full proceeds of your labor. Obviously, there's a common fund, and ultimately, the reason why I agree with this is because it would plant the seeds for a more egalitarian society, and you could actually do away with the gap between mental and physical labor with it by simply paying people to go to school. So, like, it takes a doctor years and years to go to school. How about instead of that doctor shilling out all that money, you pay the doctor while they're in school, and then you pay them when they're out in the field? You see what I'm saying? And that way,
Yeah.
they got their compensation while they're in school, and they're getting their compensation while they're a doctor. And this will this will finally end the gap between mental and physical labor, and like the justification for paying one more over the other.
See, when it comes to economics, I don't fundamentally disagree with Marxism. It's more of the governmental structure that I philosophically don't align myself with. But
the problem isn't power; it's holding power accountable.
yeah, and that's the thing. I don't think that Marxism I don't think a Marxist society can properly hold power accountable because of the dynamic. But I feel like if we keep on talking about this, we're going to move in circles. But I have to go in a couple minutes. But do you want to give your closing statements in this debate?
I don't really have much to say. My biggest problem with anarchism is it denies the class nature of the state, as though the state isn't an apparatus by which one class rules over another. And the other thing is you have such an issue with hierarchy that you don't acknowledge the necessity for hierarchy when a situation clearly calls for it. And that's all I have to say.
All right. So, for the sake of fairness, I'm not going to give a closing statement right after you gave yours. But all I want to say is that I do feel as though I agree with Marx in many ways in regards to economics. But when it comes to the nature of the state, I feel like I fundamentally disagree with the way we should move forward as a society and the role of the state in that future. So that's just my closing statements.
All right.
So thanks for having this conversation, and I hope we can have another one sometime. But,
Of course. Yep, that's all I have to say. Peace out.